populations and a readiness to remove them by any means available. As indigenous peoples were driven from their ancestral homes, the lure of cheap or free land drew thousands of immigrants, many of whom acquired properties which they eventually turned into Europeanized landscapes and viable economic units. In these efforts, they met their labor needs by producing large families, and in those places where economic possibilities encouraged a high demand for labor, made extensive use of unfree labor, including indentured servants, transported felons, and enslaved Indians and Africans. Scattering themselves over the countryside in a process of extensive rustication and privatization of land, they created interior market towns in which they could exchange their produce, and a few strategically situated port towns from which they could market their commodities. To protect the properties they were creating and to maintain orderly social relations, they used their self-governing powers to introduce English common law legal culture, which was sufficiently indeterminate and flexible that it could be adapted to many different physical and social environments. In their determination to anglicize their new homes, they endeavored as well to transplant English social and religious institutions and practices. Keeping social spending to a minimum, they invested little of their hard-earned wealth in social improvement, and practically nothing at all in the evangelization of non-white people, whether they were indigenous or imported. The religious institutions they established being oriented almost entirely to the settler population. In the process of creating new societies with growing populations, economic resources, and social capital that, for all their difference one from another, were all fundamentally English, they developed distinctive cultural hearths, which by the mid-18th century could be replicated on new territories as demographic and economic growth created demands for expansion further into the North American continent, and new indigenous homelands were cleared of their inhabitants. If the culture hearth created in the early English West Indies was limited in its expansive possibilities to islands and adjacent coastal areas and tropical or semi-tropical regions, the various culture hearths established along the eastern seaboard of North America had a vast extent of territory before them. Well in place by the closing decades of the 17th century and fully developed by the time of the American Revolution, this British colonial system had proven fully capable of mobilizing the periodic explosive bursts of human energy and population increase that powered expansion from older colonial cores into new peripheries of settlement. By the era of the American Revolution, this settler juggernaut had become a powerful engine for territorial expansion. The achievement of independence did not end colonialism in the United States. The product of a settler revolt that left settlers in full control and the colonial situation of indigenous and enslaved people, largely unchanged, continued settler domination of the political system, ensured settler domination of the political systems of the several states and the national government that they would construct, and ensured that economic, social, political, and legal traditions from the colonial period would survive through the Revolutionary era and on into the early national period of United States history. That colonial processes as they related to expansion of territory and relations with indigenous people would perpetuate well into the national era the principles of colonialism that had underlain the colonial system that had taken shape during the 17th and 18th centuries, and that the national story would merely represent an extension of the colonial story. Certainly, to an extent rarely appreciated by historians of the national experience, the continuities between pre- and post-revolutionary expansion are very impressive. After 1776, as before, settlers, including speculators, investors, merchants, and others who hoped to tap into or profit from the new markets opened up by new settlements, not governments, demonstrated the most agency and energy in the process of Indian clearance and settlement. They poured into new territories, took the lead in driving out the indigenous populations, introduced slavery wherever legally and economically feasible, aggressively demanded the establishment of the systems of law and governance with which they were familiar, and constructed polities that were every bit as distinctive one from another as the early colonies. To be sure, the American national government itself, the creature of the many partially amalgamating original polities, provided more help in the colonizing process than the British state had ever done. And colonization after 1790 increasingly carried with it overtones of an American national destiny. Just as the early colonizers and their immediate descendants had spoken of their achievements as contributions to the profit, strength, and greater glory of the British Empire in its struggle against what they thought of as the despotic and Catholic French or Spanish foe, post-1776 settlers no doubt saw themselves as agents for enhancing the territory and might of the American Republic. Yet the spread of settlement had more to do far more to do with the needs, desires, and self-understandings of individual settlers and promoters than with any national goals such as manifest destiny. Slogans may have given added meaning to their activities, but the vast majority of settlers were driven far less by nation-building impulses than by land hunger, profit-seeking, and eagerness to exploit new resources. The same motives that had driven settlement and colony formation during the colonial era. And like their predecessors, they principally acted not as agents for the state, but for themselves. So strong was the settler desire for land and hegemony over it that the national state was carried along by its force, more controlled than controlling. What could have been more thoroughly colonial than the extension of this aggressive colonizing process into the new lands that the national state claimed by treaty or purchase? Similarly, national era like colonial era settlers operated immediately within local and provincial contexts, now called territories or states, and deeply engaged themselves in the process of community building and polity formation, but would provide them with the protections associated with the British legal system, which, notwithstanding their new republican status, continued to comprise an important part of their legal and political heritage. Just as the original states had formed the Union of 1787, in the new states, the establishment of settler hegemony over each territory shifted power and ownership from the original inhabitants to the settlers and the governments they created. At the same time, the new states imported the colonial system of racial subordination, even where slavery was prohibited by national law. Settlers in the states constructed after 1776, like their colonial predecessors, exhibited a massive heedlessness about the lives and rights of those who did not share their culture or look like them. And they used the same already deeply internalized ideology to justify their continuing dispossession of native peoples. Indeed, to the extent that they had any qualms about what they were doing to indigenous peoples and Africans, settlers justified their behavior in terms of the story they constructed to explain the larger meaning of their lives. According to that story, heard in variations throughout the colonial and national Americas, settlers of European descent were engaged in a noble enterprise, bringing empty or underutilized lands into a cultivated state, reorganizing them into bounded spaces where property and labor could be acquired and secured by local political and judicial institutions, and rendering their resources productive. In their own minds, they were constructing outposts of Western civility in the wilderness, and thereby contributing to the grand project of bringing civilization to a vast new world. For settlers living under an American national flag, the colonial system had changed its name, but not its character. Thank you.